He ends up in Yugoslavia against a guy named Monty Parlov in the first ever cruiserweight championship fight of the world. And there's a photo right there. That's Marvin. And to his right is a gentleman named Elmer Boyce. So Elmer Boyce is a businessman, and Elmer Boyce is a boxing promoter. And Marvin and Boyce have a relationship that basically started at the Ox. At one point, I don't know if you're familiar with the Oxford Cafe in Missoula, but Boyce owned the Ox. You know? So Marvin was essentially Boyce's indentured servant. So Marvin would work fixing and restoring gaming machines and delivering pinball machines and boxing. So Marvin was training essentially in this little makeshift gym that Boyce had attached to Montana Music Rentals. So if you could kind of imagine what it looked like, was about maybe half the size of this room. Marvin had enough room to spar and hit the heavy bag and listen to Creedence Clearwater, and enough room basically to swing a cat in. So Marvin would finish one shift and then he'd go out and he would start sparring and he would start boxing. And one visitor said it had all the makings of a kitchen cabinet. That's as far as how big it was and the size. So to give you a kind of a good indication of kind of what resources Marvin did and didn't have. So Marvin makes it over to Yugoslavia, and that's where we're gonna pick up. Is Marvin goes to Yugoslavia, and by all accounts, Marvin beats Monty Parlov, but it's in Parlov's hometown, so it's a draw. So they go back to Vegas and they have to rematch. So nothing comes easy for Marvin. Marvin has to fight basically 30 rounds to win a world title, and your average guy fights 15. So I'm going to take us to Las Vegas, and kind of here we are in the rematch. So. This is kind of a little behind the scenes, So Don King is there. Of course, everyone knows the famous luminary Don King, known for his hair. So Don King visited Marvin in his locker room before the fight. He watched his Camel shadow box for an extended period, working up a good sweat so he could enter the ring hot and ready to fight. To keep the heat in his muscles, he put on a white flannel robe and his blue silk robe over it. The scene in a dressing room before a fight is an elaborate slice of theatrics. Fighters work off their nervousness, each in their own distinct manner. Some, like Camel, threw punches in the air or into their trainer's hand pads. Others listened to music to soothe themselves and danced their butterflies away. And still a few others were in the bathroom relieving their bowels or spitting or blowing their noses to clear their respiratory tract. Some fighters pray to the gods of pugilism, masculinity, and chance that they will exit the ring on their own 2 feet and not on a stretcher wrapped in a neck brace. Marvin felt as if every detail was magnified by the importance of this match. So much depended on him. The hopes of his people, his state, and his own ambition seemed more than just symbolic. So Marvin, he wins the world title, and he has one title defense before he gets done in by a guy named Carlos de Leon. So in his first title defense, he fights de Leon, and here's a little bit of that fight, and here's what happens as Marvin's getting ready to walk into the ring. The Indian, quote unquote, entered the ring with a look of confidence. For some, it was their first look at a real Indian. Many had seen caricatures from a century of Western movies, befeathered and war-painted warriors, often cunning and cruel, sometimes drunk and ignorant, and mostly silent, except when whooping war noises. Marvin Camel was no caricature of the past. Handsome, soft-spoken, gentlemanly, he was antithetical to the prevalence of the Indian as a stereotype. Sauntering to the ring, de Leon looked like a serious challenger. He had the cocky look on his face as if he felt he was going to swat away Camel like a fly. He had worn that smirk for the whole week before the fight. It had struck Camel as an attempt as a major psych-out, somewhat ineffective. But de Leon seemed incredibly sharp and focused on putting on one hell of a show. So de Leon wins that fight. And I thought this was kind of a nice passage about Marvin in that fight. Marvin ended up with more than 45 or 50 stitches on one eye, or above one eye over here. And actually his face, and there's a picture of it in the book, was so grotesque, that it ended up on Good Morning America. I think they had a little joke about it as it went over the screen. Both these commentators said, why would anyone do this to themselves? But Marvin didn't quit, and I thought this passage was sort of indicative of some of the pain that Marvin faced. Although bleeding profusely from cuts over and under his eyes, Camel refused to quit. His face looked like it had been shaved by a blind man with a sharp razor. At fight's end, he was nauseous, dehydrated, and his left hand was throbbing as if someone had injected needles into his knuckles. So here we are. So Marvin loses his world title, and Marvin decides, well, what's next? What am I going to do now? So he's getting increasingly disgruntled with Montana. He's getting increasingly disgruntled with the fact that he can't find any good, decent sparring partners, and things just aren't going well. So Marvin one day just decides that he's just going to leave. And this is sort of a powerful part in Marvin's life, is that he leaves Montana. And I'm going to read a little passage about that. So. In the summer of 1983, Marvin Camel made a decision that would change the rest of his life and change the way his own family and others on the Flathead Reservation viewed him. With little money and a chip on his shoulder, Camel hopped on his Honda 750 motorcycle and headed to Los Angeles. He packed a pair of boxing trunks, photo identification, and a notebook with names and contacts. He left behind 3 children, several brothers and sisters, friends and critics, and the only home he had ever known. Camel went to Los Angeles because he was tired of fighting in Montana for little pay. He was tired of his home life, tired of losing money, and tired of not having adequate sparring partners. Filled with bitterness and recrimination, he was tired of the psychologically inferior structure of his birthplace lands. He felt as if people were out to demean him and demolish his sense of accomplishment. On the reservation, he felt like a faded pencil drawing. You could see him, but you couldn't quite make him out. He couldn't even quite make out himself. So Marvin's gone. But Marvin gets another opportunity. There's another division, there's another federation forming called the IBF, the International Boxing Federation, and the International Boxing Federation has a cruiserweight title fight. So Marvin is ranked #1, and Marvin gets on a plane, and he goes by himself, and he fights a guy named Roddy McDonald in McDonald's hometown in Nova Scotia. So Marvin does this alone. He has no trainer, he has no cornerman. He just goes out there and goes into some hostile terrain. So I'm going to read you what it's like maybe as Marvin gets into that hostile terrain in Nova Scotia. December 13th, 1983, the pungent smell of sweat and cigars hovers over the 40,000 spectators wedged shoulder to shoulder inside the Halifax Metro Center. The arena thwacks with energy and expectation. Fans swig beer and place bets on tonight's historic match, the International Boxing Federation's first World Cruiserweight title fight. Most, if not all, wager their money on the first fighter to duck under the ropes. Roddy McDonald, 177 pounds, a 23-year-old Canadian with roots in New Waterford, Nova Scotia, and fighting out of Toronto. He can taste the crowd's overwhelming support. There was only one other person there who wasn't Canadian, Camel recalls, referring to Alvin Goodman, who was the IBF director and legal counsel. I felt a lot like Custer with 3,000 Native Americans coming at him to get his scalp. So there's a little controversy here. Marvin hits McDonald with a great body punch, right? But a lot of the Canadians, they didn't see it as a body punch. So there's some ambiguity there. Was it a body punch? Was it a low blow? So referee stops the fight. Bottles start coming in. The Canadians, start throwing things, cups, water bottles, anything they can get their hands on. And they asked McDonald about it in the locker room. They said, what was the punch? Was it a legit punch? And McDonald says, yeah, it was a good punch. It got me in the solar plexus. I went down. He's a legitimate champion. So I thought this was actually kind of funny, was that the Canadians, you know, start sending Marvin letters, apologizing for causing a little bit of a riot and for misbehaving. So this one's great. This one came around Christmas time, and this is a card that was sent by a gentleman who says, "Please accept my apologies for the expressing of displeasure to you and the IBF following your fight with Roddy McDonald. I now accept the fact that there were no low blows and that you are the undisputed champion of the world. Continued success and Merry Christmas." So I mean, those are great. So a couple of those kept coming in. So I thought those were kind of fun. So Marvin, you know, Marvin's reign as champion, it doesn't last very long. In fact, you know, the next fight in, he fights a guy named Leroy Murphy, and he fights him in Billings. And by all accounts, and all three judges' scorecards, Marvin is ahead. It's a 15-round fight. And going into the final round, the referee sees something in Marvin. He sees a cut, and he waves the fight off. Doesn't give Marvin the opportunity to continue on. So that also ends in a hullabaloo, a little bit of pandemonium, you know, but on the side of the Montana fans who were kind of crazed about the decision. No one could believe it. Marvin is further embittered by that and further kind of hostile against the state of Montana for not addressing that. He appealed to the athletic board, and the athletic board said, "Hey, you know, you guys consented to the official. There's nothing we can do about it." So the interesting thing about this fight is that, actually there are a couple of interesting things, but Marvin has nothing. You know, there was a man named C.C. Ryder who Marvin met in Los Angeles, named Clarence Collins, who Marvin hired to be his manager for that fight. C.C. Ryder hops on the plane with the $30,000 that Marvin, a check that Marvin was supposed to receive payment for, and Marvin never sees a dime from that fight. And the fight earlier that he beat Roddy McDonald in Nova Scotia, Marvin didn't see any money because his contract was kind of in dispute, and it was in the process of being sold to one person to another. So these are fights that Marvin saw nothing for, nothing. And Bob Campbell told me this story, one of Marvin's brothers, and I thought that this was particularly kind of compelling, was that Marvin was at home borrowing money from his mom. And so here's that passage. "In times of stress, a man often does things he later regrets, and he acts hastily without examining the consequences of his action. Sometimes he repents, but it may be too late for forgiveness. Sometimes a man simply disappears to avoid further psychological or emotional conflict. It may be a combination of all these factors that led Marvin to turn his back on his home state, on his family, and all the people that helped make him a two-time world champion. The Montana athletic decision pushed Marvin away from Montana, leaving him with a bitter taste he struggled for decades to overcome. As a boxer, he had long ago made his peace with danger and risk, but he could never make peace with the Murphy decision and its aftermath. I remember Marvin coming around after the Murphy fight, and he had nothing," said Bob Campbell. "I remember our mother having to give him $20. He circled around the house, looked like he was deciding whether or not to take it. He looked ashamed. Marvin didn't refuse the payment. I borrowed $20 from my mom," said Marvin. "I had hit bottom, rock bottom. It was all the money there was. It was all the money there was in the world for Marvin Campbell. What did I have? I stood there on Highway 93 with the belt I'd won, a three-piece suit, and no place to go. I had no place to go in the world." So Marvin ends up, you know, in Los Angeles, and he takes a couple odd jobs. He's fighting basically at this point as the opponent, you know, as they call him, you know, the kind of the sacrificial lamb, the guy that goes in there and essentially is the stepping stone. So Marvin gets beat all over the world. I mean, he gets beat badly in Denmark by a Kenyan, and then he gets beat in Argentina. And he has a detached retina, but he's still fighting. So he fights all the way up until 89, 90 at the age of 40 years old. And again, Marvin was essentially, I guess, what you would call just kind of a piece of meat.